There are giants in both the biblical and Norse traditions. Stories of beings who existed at the boundaries between the divine and mortal realms, challenging the established order of creation, were prevalent in the ancient world. Among the most compelling of these liminal beings are the Nephilim of biblical tradition and the jötnar of Norse mythology, both of whom occupied complex positions within their respective cosmologies. Though separated by geography, culture, and theological framework, these entities share remarkable parallels in their origins, their relationships with divine powers, and their roles as catalysts for cosmic transformation. The origins of the Nephilim and the jötnar reveal both cultures' anxieties about boundaries between the sacred and profane. The Nephilim, as described in Genesis 6:1-4, were the offspring of the sons of God, Bene Elohim, and the daughters of men, representing a forbidden union that violated the separation between celestial and terrestrial spheres. In contrast, the jötnar were not products of divine-human mixing, but were primordial beings who existed before the gods themselves, emerging from the ancient void of Ginnungagap Gap and the body of the first giant, Ymir. While the Nephilim represented a corruption of divine order through inappropriate reproduction, the jötnar embodied the raw, untamed forces of nature that preceded civilization and cosmic order itself. The relationship between these giant figures and their respective divine communities reveals fundamentally different theological structures. The Bene Elohim who fathered the Nephilim committed what the biblical narrative presents as a grave transgression, one that contributed to God's decision to cleanse the earth through the flood. The jötnar, however, maintained a far more complex and ambiguous relationship with the Aesir and Vanir gods of Norse mythology. The gods and giants were not absolute enemies, but rather engaged in an intricate web of conflict, cooperation, marriage, and exchange. Odin himself was the grandson of a giant, and several gods took giant wives, blurring the lines between these supposed opposites in ways unthinkable in the biblical framework. The cultural function of these beings within their narratives demonstrates how different societies use such figures to explain disorder and threat. The Nephilim served as an explanation for the prevalence of wickedness that necessitated the flood, providing a supernatural origin for human corruption and violence. In post-biblical Jewish traditions, particularly in texts like 1 Enoch, the Nephilim became increasingly associated with teaching forbidden knowledge to humanity, introducing weapons, cosmetics, sorcery, and other arts that led humans astray. The jötnar represented the constant threat of chaos pressing against the fragile order maintained by the gods, personifying destructive natural forces like avalanches, earthquakes, harsh winters, and volcanic eruptions that could devastate the carefully maintained world of gods and humans alike. Folklore and legend expanded upon these figures in ways that reveal their hold on the popular imagination. In Jewish apocryphal literature, the Nephilim grew to enormous proportions, with some traditions claiming they stood hundreds of feet tall and eventually turned to cannibalism when ordinary sustenance proved insufficient. The Book of Enoch describes how the Watchers, the angels who fathered the Nephilim, were punished and bound until the final judgment, while their giant offspring were destroyed in the flood, though their disembodied spirits supposedly became demons. Norse folklore developed extensive narratives around individual jötnar, giving them distinct personalities, families, and domains, with figures like Thjazi and Thrymr becoming subjects of detailed mythological tales that explored the ongoing tension between order and chaos. The role of these beings in their respective eschatologies reveals perhaps the most striking parallel between the two traditions. The Nephilim's destruction in the biblical flood represents divine judgment against corruption and the restoration of moral order, though the biblical text suggests that similar beings may have appeared again afterward, as Numbers 13:33 mentions that the Israelite spies saw Nephilim in Canaan. The jötnar play a central role in Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, where they break free from their realm and assault Asgard alongside other forces of chaos. During this final battle, both gods and giants perish, with the world consumed by fire and flood before being reborn, purified and renewed. The intellectual and magical capabilities attributed to these beings further distinguish their roles within their mythologies. In the Enochian literature, the Watchers and their Nephilim offspring were credited with teaching humanity astronomy, metalworking, herbalism, and various forms of divination and sorcery, representing a disruption of proper divine order. The jötnar were likewise associated with wisdom and magic, particularly the dangerous and transgressive forms of cider magic that Odin learned from them. The giant Mimir possessed a well of wisdom, and Odin sacrificed an eye to drink from it, while the giantess Gunnlod guarded the mead of poetry that Odin stole through seduction and trickery. The relationship between these mythological beings and concepts of divine justice reveals fundamentally different theological frameworks. In the biblical narrative, the flood that destroyed the Nephilim represented God's righteous judgment against corruption, an act of cosmic cleansing governed by absolute ethical standards. Ragnarok, however, was not presented as divine judgment, but rather as inevitable fate, a cosmic cycle in which both gods and giants would perish. The Norse conception lacked the biblical emphasis on moral causation. The apocalypse would come not because of wickedness, but because it was weird, that which must be. This distinction reflects different understandings of cosmic order, divine will, and the relationship between power and morality. The influence of these mythological figures on later literature and culture demonstrates their enduring power in the human imagination. The Nephilim became central to various esoteric and occult traditions, appearing in everything from medieval grimoires to modern fantasy literature, populating the works of Milton and Blake, and continuing to appear in contemporary fiction, film, and video games. The jötnar similarly influenced countless works of literature, from Wagner's operatic Ring Cycle to Marvel's comic books and films, where the frost giants of Jotunheim threaten the cosmos. Both sets of beings have proven remarkably adaptable. Their essential nature, powerful beings who challenge divine order, speaking to persistent human concerns about authority, power, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. The comparative study of these beings illuminates fundamental differences in how Hebrew and Norse cultures conceived of cosmic order and the divine. The biblical worldview presented a God who created the cosmos through will and word, establishing clear boundaries and moral laws that should not be transgressed, with the Nephilim representing a violation requiring dramatic divine intervention. Norse cosmology, by contrast, began not with creation from nothing, but with the interaction of opposing forces in the void of Ginnungagap, from which the first giant emerged. Order was carved out by the gods from the body of this primordial giant, meaning that chaos and order, giants and gods, were eternally intertwined rather than absolutely opposed. The Nephilim of biblical tradition and the jötnar of Norse mythology, despite emerging from vastly different cultural contexts, share remarkable parallels that illuminate universal human concerns about boundaries, transgression, and cosmic transformation. The Nephilim, born from forbidden unions between divine and human, embodied corruption that necessitated the flood's cleansing judgment, while the jötnar, primordial beings predating the gods themselves, represented the chaotic forces that would ultimately participate in Ragnarok's apocalyptic renewal. Yet the differences between these figures prove equally instructive, revealing the distinct ways Hebrew and Norse cultures understood divine power, moral order, and the relationship between civilization and wilderness. The enduring fascination with both the Nephilim and the jötnar in literature, film, and popular culture demonstrates that these ancient figures continue to speak to fundamental questions about power, transgression, and the fragile boundaries that separate order from chaos.